Our next section and our next few sections are going to focus on factoring. And what we talk about when we're talking about factoring is rewriting an expression in an equivalent form using multiplication. You've talked about factors all the way back to 3rd, 4th grade when you first talked about multiplication, because we can look at an example as simple as 12 equals 3 times 4. That would be writing 12 in a form of its factors, because 3 times 3 and 4 are factors of 12. You've also used factoring when you think back to fractions, when you had to find a greatest common factor in order to find a common denominator. And also when you did prime factorization back in, I believe, the 5th grade, where you made factor trees, and that's another form of a factorization, rewriting a number or rewriting a value as a multiplication problem that is equivalent to it. That's what we're going to be doing over the next week, week and a half, is we're going to spend a lot of time looking at factoring, and we're going to apply that to polynomials. To start with today, we're going to focus on factoring a polynomial using the greatest common factor. You'll hear that referred to as GCF, just like you did in previous classes. When we're talking about the factoring a polynomial in that form, we're talking about really the inverse or the opposite of the distributive property. The distributive property, as you all know, says we take this 3x and we multiply it by x and we multiply it by 2. That makes 3x squared plus 6x. And that's the basics of the distributive property. The polynomial factoring using greatest common factor takes that exact same process and works it backwards. We're now going to start with that 3x squared plus 6x. And we're going to look at this factoring as what can I divide out of 3x squared and 6x. So we're looking for common factors we can divide out and the greatest common factor that we can divide out. In this case, 3x is the largest thing that goes into both terms. So I divide out a 3x and I'm left with x plus 2. This is exactly the same as we said on the first screen there, where we said we could rewrite 12 as 3 times 4. We're just rewriting 3x squared plus 6x as 3x times x plus 2. So the basic process for factoring out a polynomial using the greatest common factor is 2 steps. Number 1, look through the numbers and the variables and look for the largest number that goes into both numbers and the largest variable that goes into both variables. And so when you do that, you then take that value that you find as your greatest common factor and rewrite the polynomial with that in front of a parenthesis times whatever expression remains after you've divided out the greatest common factor. Let's look at an example. If I give you this binomial, 8x cubed minus 12x squared, and I say we want to write that in factored form. Well, we look at 8 and 12 and we say what's the largest number that goes into both of those? Hopefully you all can come up with 4. And then you look at your x's. We have 3 x's and 2 x's. Both terms have at least 2 x's in them, so we can divide out 4x squared. That's the greatest common factor. So to write this in factored form, we write the 4x squared in front of a parenthesis, and then we divide each term. 8x cubed divided by 4x squared. Well, 8 divided by 4 is 2. There was 3 x's, we divided 2 out, so there's 1 left. 12x squared divided by 4x squared. 12 divided by 4 is 3. X squared divided by x squared is 1. Anything divided by itself is 1. So 3 times 1 is 3. So our answer, our factored form, is 4x squared times 2x minus 3. Alright, one more example, and then we'll set you loose. This same concept of factoring using GCF can also apply to a trinomial. Again, it's the same ideas that you used back in 5th grade when you list the factors of multiple numbers. In this case, in order to factor a trinomial, we need to come up with a value that can go into all 3 terms. So we look at the numbers, 6, 12, and 9. What is the largest number that goes into 6, 12, and 9? That would be 3. And you look at your x's. You have 3 x's, 2 x's, and 1 x. They all have at least 1 x. So our greatest common factor is 3x. So we rewrite our trinomial with the factored greatest common factor in front, 3x, times 2x squared plus 4x minus 3. To make sure I've done everything correctly, it's not a bad idea to do a quick check and go back through the distributive property. We're generally more comfortable going with the distributive property than we are with factoring. So if you do 3x times 2x squared, that gives you 6x cubed. 3x times 4x is 12x squared, and 3x times 3 is 9x. That tells me I did factor correctly as long as I divided out the greatest common factor. One thing to check for to make sure you've done the greatest common factor with the variables anyways is to look and make sure your answer should not have a variable in all three terms. If there's a variable in all three terms, that variable could have been divided out. Alright, hopefully everything is clear. Good luck. If you have questions, make sure you ask.